Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Richard Reeves with us today. We'll chat with Richard in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Richard Reeves is the founder and president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. Before founding AIBM in 2023, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. While at Brookings, he focused on policies related to economic inequality, racial justice, social mobility, and boys and men. He is the author of several books, including Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It, and Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That is a Problem, and What to Do About It. Inspired by his own experiences as a father and policy expert, Richard founded AIBM to bring awareness to the challenges facing boys and men today and to develop evidence-based solutions. Richard, welcome into the back room.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to just start by playing devil's advocate a little bit. So You wrote a book in 2022 called Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. I'm going to kind of go in and out of that as well as your essay that you wrote this summer. But I want to start, like I said, playing devil's advocate a bit. Men are the dominant gender in our culture. Men hold most of the power. Men dominate politics, corporations, Wall Street, the media, entertainment, the military, sports. And now with efforts to destroy DEI policies to level the playing field, it just seems men are poised for even more privilege. Now, if someone said to me, people of color, immigrants, seniors, the sick and the poor are struggling, women are struggling, I'd be all in. So help us understand why young men, and perhaps especially young white men, are struggling so much today.
Well, I think the important point to make is that actually it is young men of color who are struggling the most, even in absolute terms. And so you just listed a bunch of groups with the exception of women, but sort of low-income people, immigrants, etc. Half of those are men, depending on how you categorize it. And so the difficulty with this debate is that you can look at the top of society, and you just mentioned politics, you mentioned corporate leadership, etc., and continue to see that in those very senior positions, there is a lack of representation of women. That is absolutely true. But we shouldn't assume that the whole of society feels like the boardrooms of Google and like Congress, right? And so where I live in Southern Appalachia now, just in kind of East Tennessee, where fewer than half the men are working. There's huge death rates, very low life expectancy, etc. And it's not at all clear to me that the men, this is a predominantly white area actually, but I could also talk about Baltimore, where my godson lives, or my son teaches now. Not at all clear to me that those men are in a dominant economic, social, cultural position. They are struggling educationally, culturally, and economically. And so I think it's just the invitation here, let's put it positively, is to think two thoughts at once. Is to think, there's a bunch of stuff that we still need to continue doing for women and girls. But that doesn't mean we can't also worry about why men aren't going to college, why wages for working class men are completely stagnant, why the male suicide rate is 4 times higher than the female one, and why the suicide rate among young men has risen by 1/3 since 2010, right? When you have a increase of 1/3 in a cause of death among young men in 15 years, the idea that you can't look at that, you can't say that's a problem and that's a specifically gendered problem. I'm not allowed to look at that problem, Andy, because we still don't have enough women on boards. I actually think that that's absurd. So I get what you're doing. You're channeling an understandable reaction. And I think the discomfort with the conversation is real and honorable. But if we allow ourselves to stay in that discomfort, and in particular mean that we neglect those problems won't go away. Those problems turn into grievances. Those grievances can then be weaponized. Better to deal with them, right?
No, and I totally agree with that. And just to clarify, I'm not saying it's an either or situation. It's just the connectivity between, let's say, the suicide rate and tacking it to a much larger problem across the board in terms of gender. But I want to ask you about the suicide rate. Yeah. So what is the reason for that, though? Why are we seeing in the last 15 years that kind of increase in male suicide?
Yeah. I mean, the honest answer is, around young men, we don't know. And so until 2010, for the first decade of the century, it was really middle-aged men. It was men in their 50s in particular, where we saw a big increase, 40% increase in suicide rates among that group of men. That coincided with the Great Recession, with very difficult economic conditions, especially for working class men, who were the ones who were most affected. And there was this term, deaths of despair, that Anne Case and Angus Deaton termed, which was suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol. And so there was an economic story that could help to explain the rise in suicide rates among middle-aged men, which have now thankfully leveled out. It's not clear what's happening with young men. And so I can tell a story about why a 55-year-old man was tragically coming to the end of his rope in, say, 2009, 2008. I don't have a good story yet for why a 25-year-old man is now more likely to come to that conclusion than the 55-year-old in 2025. And so we need to do more work, and we can speculate, and I will speculate about isolation, a sense of neededness, a sense of connection, a sense of purpose, can speculate about potential causes, but the honest answer that I have to give is that we don't know yet, but it's definitely a warning sign that something is not right with that generation of men, and therefore we should look at that in the spirit of trying to find solutions. And again, as you said a moment ago, in a non-zero sum way, right? We can do that and do the stuff we need to do for women.
Yeah, and anything I ask you or any of my opinions are partly shaped by the fact that I have 3 daughters. I also have a son. And so I've spent almost 40 years raising children of both sexes, and hearing from their side of like what their life is like and their interactions with the opposite sex. But you mentioned something interesting, a couple of things about isolation and then also connectivity, because I think on some level those two clash, because the internet, social media, has given young people, male and female, an enormous opportunity to connect with family, with friends, to make new friends, to meet people of like-minded interests, et cetera, at the same time as we're learning from a lot of these mass shootings that happen, that young men are finding connection in not a really good way through gaming. There are some apps and programs I don't even know of, but it's like the deep dark web that a lot of these young men are going into. And that's where a lot of the radicalization is becoming, because they're bonding in this isolation. But how much do you blame or place responsibility on social media and the internet, and how the availability of so much content, and especially through algorithms, the kind of content that is being pushed to them about their own masculinity and their own self-image and women and how to interact with women, fighting? I mean, we see all these things that are taking place. So it's just interesting when you think about isolation, but also connectivity.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of ironies here, and I want to be clear. Well, first, let me ask you a question. How old is your son?
33.
Okay, yeah, mine are all in their 20s now. And so I think things have changed radically, honestly, even in the last sort of 10 years. And so I think one of my boys was 15 when he said something like, I think we're okay, but I'm really worried about the 12-year-olds. Because things have really changed. Like he said, like, in the last 3 years, right? If you hit that technology at 12, it's like, oh, wow, okay.
Wow.
So it's not just like micro generations.
And how much did COVID play into what he said? Was it around COVID?
Quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, you see this massive cohort effect with COVID, right? It's just hit as a wave of, as a group of kids who were hit very hard by COVID, in particular the extended school closures. That really, I think, had different effects for girls and boys. That actually affected girls a bit more academically, because girls do better at school. So if you close the schools, that's going to affect the girls more than the boys. It affected everybody, but because girls typically do better at school, then if they can't go to school, they suffer more. But the isolation effects seem to have been greater for boys. in some surveys. The way I think about this is that when we talk about online world, social media, algorithm, what we're describing is the water that everyone under the age of 25 or 30 swims in. It is just the world now, right? And so there's a tendency, if you're a little bit older, as we are, and to sort of segment it and think of it as tech and online. We talk about things like screen time and all that kind of stuff, right? We have this. It's very difficult for us, I think, to adjust to this world where this is just like all they've grown up with. They're so-called digital natives, and I have to tell you that there's a few things to note are that crime rates have gone down very significantly in the last few decades. Right. And the reason I emphasize that is because I think sometimes when people talk about this, they don't know that. Actually, people think, and most crime is committed by men, especially violent crime. Mm-hmm. Right. So let's be clear, violent crime rates, which is mostly committed by men, massively gone down, probably roughly halved in the last 30 years, right? So men are much less violent today than they were. Right. And so I think that with the discussion of like shooters, radicalization, exception, we should be very careful not to assume the exceptions are the rule, right? Mm-hmm. Which is more about retreat, I think, more about isolation. And so then the question is like, what is that happening with tech? And I'll stop after this and maybe one example. Like gaming is a great example of a technology shock that is both very good and potentially quite bad. It's very good because it's great fun. It's actually very connecting. I've seen my own sons keep all kinds of relationships going. It's amazing to watch, and they're laughing and they're having fun and they're doing something together while they're talking, which is particularly important for boys and young men. And then they arrange on Discord while they're playing a game. They arrange to meet each other later and go and do something, right? And so it can be very connective. And this is very top of mind for me. I was at an event with Common Sense Media earlier this week in New York, and there was a panel of 4 young men and talking about their online lives. And they're all in very good schools that support them very well and from different backgrounds. And all 4 of them said they felt safer and freer online than in the real world.
Interesting.
And I think, okay, that's interesting. I think there's a freedom to the interaction, to the space, to like the real world feels quite challenging to a lot of boys and young men right now, right? To negotiate, and it always has been, right? This is part of it. Like life is hard, that's part of it. But if you then only game, like if that's all you do, and it crowds out the in real life activities, that's when it's a problem. So the problem is not the gaming, it is the problem of if you're only gaming, that means you're not doing other things like dating, exercise, outside, in real life, flesh and blood, embodied relationships. And so it's like all things, like in moderation, it's awesome. But if it becomes your life, if that's the only world you live in, which is true for too many of our young men now, so let's make some better alternatives. Let's make the rest of life better. Let's make, like I did, I think the UK just published a survey saying that more young men are on playing video games than they are in school. More hours a week gaming than in school. And honestly, my reaction to that was, well, school sucks. Right. And games are awesome. So what do you expect?
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. And I just, if you asked me a year ago, I'd say that the internet and social media is going to destroy the universe. I'm not a fan. I think there's great things about it, but I see so many problems with it, especially with young people. But when you think about men, boys, they've just never, you go back 100 years, 200 years, never been brought up to believe that they can show emotion, they can be vulnerable. And to your point, so now you take those qualities or lack of certain qualities and give them a screen where they can be either anonymous or like it's only 2-dimensional or 1-dimensional. They could be more comfortable in that lack of vulnerability and intimacy and empathy or whatever. And I just think it's a huge part of the problem. It's like digital masculinity, right? I'm sure you get a lot of not so nice emails and posts on your social media like I do. Almost all the time it's men. You know what I mean? Like the people who say the worst, most vile things are men. And I think it's to your point that online men have been able to adapt to this other persona that just gives them license to be unfeeling or all the things they grew up either hearing they're supposed to be or shouldn't be. And I think it's just real dangerous when they're plugged in.
Yeah, so I think you're being way too gloomy about this, Andy.
Okay.
And that, which is not to say that there aren't issues, but I don't think you're seeing enough of the upside. So I'll
Upside
say one thing is that
upside of the internet?
of the online, yes, of the internet, yes, of the internet. The way you started, the connection that so, and again, these are anecdotes, but actually, the number of boys we published work on this who maintain friendships and connections online through gaming, and so it is one of the differences in communication style on average between men and women is that men are a little bit more comfortable communicating shoulder to shoulder. In other words, whilst engaged in another activity than face to face. Like men don't typically go face to face. It actually is a bit of a threat move for us. So that's why stereotypically, like men are going to be fishing or playing golf or hiking but I think online gaming is like an online equivalent of that shoulder to shoulder. And so I've noticed that even my own sons is that they're gaming, but they're talking while they're gaming, right? And so they're sharing information, they're sharing their concerns. They're actually been quite open with each other about the challenges with their girlfriend or whatever it is between games or while they're doing games and between laughter. And so if gaming, both in its physical and online form, is an environment where it encourages men to communicate with and engage with each other, then that's a good thing. If it's the only way they do that and it's in place of in real life, it's obviously a bad thing. But I worry quite a lot that we don't have enough spaces now where actually young men especially, do feel they've got the opportunity to be like that and perhaps to communicate in a more stereotypically masculine way, right? Which is more bantering, it's more playful, it's more doing something. Because actually we frown on that now, right? We consider that to be whatever. And so the concern that you're hearing from me about the way you framed this is that if you take it to its logical conclusion, you can end up almost like blaming the boys for liking gaming, right? When that might be one of the things that they use to connect and find valuable. And so we've got to hold a bit of balance here, I think. And there's a lot of moral panic right now about the online world. And I think there's reason for concern and regulation. I'm close to Jonathan Haidt, do a lot of work with him, but the tone of like panic can lead to pathologization. And that actually tends to drive young men further away from the conversation rather than drawing them in. We're better at, this is Equimundo's line from Gary Barker. He said, right now we're doing a much better job of calling men out than of calling them in. We have to be careful about that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, like when a lot of the so-called experts talk about gun violence and the mass shootings, they either blame it on porn, they blame it on mental health, they blame it on gaming. We see in other Western countries that also have porn and gaming, and what they also have is strict gun laws, and the correlation between a lack of gun violence and strict gun laws seems to be lost on a lot of people. So I agree. It's not the gaming per se. It's just there's so many cultural influences. It's hard to really isolate what is the problem.
It's if it's becoming a substitute. Right, that it's the issue, and I think that's the same with like pornography and so on too. And the concern, we're doing work around AI companions now, which is like if gaming is substituting from building real friendships, kind of friendships in real life, if pornography or AI companions is substituting for learning, the difficult issues of forming romantic and sexual relationships, kind of bad. If kind of gambling online, if crypto or day trading or sports betting is substituting for actually getting up and going to work every day and earning money and saving it, right? That's when it's bad, right? So I see it as more this displacement thing. And what I see the problem is occurring is like when you've got this displacement effect. So the young men I worry about right now, there's like 1 in 10 men between 20 and 24. They're not in school and they're not in a job. So they don't have a job and they're not earning. We don't know what they're doing, right? But the evidence suggests that there's quite a lot of gaming going on, right? And so that's troubling to me. It doesn't trouble me that my son, who's a teacher, once he comes home and then he does some of his class prep, jumps on and plays Rainbow Six Siege with his friends and his brother, right, for a bit at the end of the day before going to bed. That does not bother me, right? That's positive, right? Because it's not his life. It's when your life online is substituting for your real life is the problem. And I just think we've got to think about, like, why is it that for so many young men that life has become more appealing than the real world? And maybe we should do something about the real world to make it more appealing and more attractive.
Well, I know you've spoken about and written about like boys clubs of America and the after school programs and things. Like that's what we grew up. I grew up when we got out of school, we went over to the Y or some other program and we played basketball, knock hockey, and just shot the shit with our friends, and because that's all we had. And you've written about how we really don't have a lot of that anymore.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's a civic space, right? It's done person to person. It's done by you, by me, anyone listening to this. Like if there's a guy listening to this conversation, I am going to say to him, there is a boy or a young man in your life right now who would really benefit from you just reaching out to them, texting or calling them saying, hey, how you doing? And then asking, now, how are you really doing? And let's go for a walk or fish or whatever. There's a young man that will benefit from you reaching out. I don't know who that is, your nephew, your cousin, maybe even your own son, whatever. But so I think it's person to person, it's real life. I mean, I think that the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, is a very powerful one and very true. I would add, some of the villages have to be men in order to raise boys. And the reason, and I wrote this piece in the Times, which I think you may be referring to, Andy, with Robert Putnam, who's famous for his work on social connection, comparing like the response in the early 20th century was we had boys really struggling in the new urban environments. And so within 10 years, we created YMCA, boys clubs, Boy Scouts of America. Like within a decade, this massive creation of civic institutions, just amazing, like in 10 years, to respond. And men stepped into those roles as leaders and mentors, etc. And we need more of that today. And right now, those organizations are desperate for male volunteers. And in fact, this is, I wouldn't normally mention this, but because you started with your devil's advocate thing about like men on top, the entire executive team of YMCA is female. And I do not know any of those people. Amazing job. I love the YMCA myself, etc. But it is the YMCA. The YWCA remains single sex and very focused on women. The YMCA has become very strongly co-ed and actually serves more girls than boys now. It has more female than male volunteers, and it has an all-female executive team. Again, you say that and you worry someone's going to hear, he hates the fact that women are in the boardroom. I hope it's clear by now that neither of us think that. But we should be honest about the fact that we might have lost something along the way, which is environments and spaces that are specifically designed to attract young men and boys, and to meet them where they are with men as part of the leadership team. And that's incumbent on all of us, I think, to step into those spaces. But I think, and again, I'm public on this, I think we will look back on the decision of Boy Scouts to rebrand itself Scouting for America and go co-ed as a mistake. Girl Scouts remains a single-sex organization serving girls and does a great job of it, by the way, in my view. Boy Scouts no longer exists. And I do think we'll look back and say, look, we get why that happened. It was for reasons of inclusion and so on. I think we'll look back and say, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. What do you think of that? Boy Scouts going co-ed?
That's an interesting question. I happen to think Boy Scouts should be Boy Scouts. I was a Cub Scout. I wasn't a Boy Scout, but I had a lot of friends in the Boy Scouts. And I'm very traditional when it comes to stuff like that, because I do agree that on some level, we do need to let boys be boys, whatever the fuck that means, and let girls be girls. But that doesn't mean it's not a zero sum. Like it doesn't mean girls can only do girl things and boys can only do boy things.
It doesn't. Yeah, you're worried that you're stereotyping and therefore prescribing, and then the boy who's not like that feels like, well, there's something wrong with him, or the girl that's not like that, and feels out of place. And we're right to worry about that. But we're also wrong, I think, to deny that there's anything valuable about some single-sex spaces. And my slightly contrarian view about this is that the Scout movement, which I've been involved in, and Girl Scouts, those single-sex environments done well, actually help to fill out our full humanity. So actually, Scouts done well promotes love, service, connection, by leaning into more sort of typically male-friendly forms of competition and team building, etc. What you're building is love, relational skills. You're learning about kind of actually done well. You're learning about understanding emotions, managing emotions, fear, etc. Done really well. Boy Scouts helps boys to develop their more feminine side and not just their more masculine side. It fills them out, right? In Girl Scouts, they do a lot of stuff on STEM, assertiveness training, being more competitive, etc. Right? Because my experience of this is that, and I had 3 boys and being a scout leader, is that it's usually not that hard to get boys to compete, right? Again, risk of stereotyping. Boys will compete over the dumbest
anything.
Well,
Anything. It's like some grown men will bet on anything.
And so actually that's and actually getting girls to be like caring towards each other and more emotionally available to each other, again, that's not usually that difficult. And so what you're doing with girls and Girl Scouts is saying, that's great, we're going to keep that, but you're going to learn some stuff about like self-advocacy. Are you interested in STEM? Are you interested in leadership, etc.? Right? So in a way, sort of filling out against the gender stereotypes. I think Boy Scouts is exactly the same thing the other way. And so ironically, I think that the case for single-sex spaces is that it makes us fuller human beings, and it reduces the extent to which we're just masculine and just feminine, because we're doing it in a way that's friendly to, and also it's less threatening. I mean, one of the reasons why boys don't put their hands up in school now, anything like as much as girls, is the fear of getting it wrong. They're ashamed. They don't want to get it wrong in front of the girls. And so they just won't put their hands up. They won't offer stuff up. And so one of the advantages of boys' schools, and the evidence on the impact of boys' schools is not clear, by the way, to be clear, but one of the things that they say is that, you know, at least the boys aren't sitting there worried that they're going to look dumb, which is what's happening in co-ed schools now.
You're a big believer in having boys be around male role models. And again, this is, a generalization, of course. We could all point to that one friend who had a single mom who was a waitress, raised 5 kids, and all the kids went to Ivy League schools. Like, all of that exists. But in general, it probably is a good idea for boys and girls to have influences of both sexes. You've talked about fathers, that fatherhood is, quote, a load-bearing wall for society. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's partly what you were just saying, which is that I think that kids, young people, they believe their eyes more than their ears. You can tell them how to be in the world. You can have like rules for kindness or, positive masculinity. You can have seminars at school on positive masculinity, which is not a very good idea if you do it badly, but they'll look at their parents. And of course, mostly what they're looking at is just how to be a good human, right? But there's also a degree to which actually you're looking at like, what does it mean to be a good man and be a good woman? How to conduct yourself in a certain way. And that's good for both girls and boys, like having men in their lives. So I'm just going to focus on men because that's what we're talking about, like men in their lives who are just showing what it means to conduct themselves well as men. Is much more powerful than any number of curricula. And so even if you're a single mom, or actually a mom in a same-sex relationship, I had a conversation with Cara Swisher about this, and or even her co-host Scott Galloway was raised by a single mom, but he said he was saved by the fact that he had a neighbor who just took an interest in him and became that father figure. Just think, Andy, how often have you heard the phrase mother figure compared to how often you hear the phrase father figure?
Right.
And because you get that lack of fathers,
probably as often as you hear the phrase deadbeat dad.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And it's so, I think that role modeling thing is important. And so if we have an opportunity to say increase the share, like the share of men in teaching has gone from 33% to 23% in the last couple of decades, right? And it's going down every year. And so we're emptying the men out of our classrooms and then lamenting the lack of positive male role models. I find that frustrating, honestly. I find it frustrating when politicians and so on will give speeches and say, these boys need more positive male role models, right? Which I agree with. And I'll say, and so what have you done about the fact that in your state, the share of men in classrooms has gone down by 10 percentage points? Do you have a policy for that? Are you doing anything about that? Because surely if there's one area you could do something about that, it would be in schools. And by the way, a third of male teachers are also coaches. So you get coaches and so on. Are you doing anything about that? And so, yeah, I do feel quite strongly that representation matters, that men and women bring overlapping, but sometimes slightly distinct contributions to these endeavors, to fatherhood and motherhood, to male and female teachers. And in just the same way, I think that boardrooms and congresses do much better when they have more women in them as well. I think women do bring some different sensibilities and skills to those rooms. That's true in elementary schools as well, right? So I think I'm very, very troubled by the fact that we still only have 25% of members of Congress are women. But I'm also troubled about the fact that we have a lower share of men than that in our schools. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think it's important to have representation in schools as well as in Congress. I think we need both.
In 2025, how do we define manhood? And how has manhood changed, the definition of manhood changed over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years? What does it mean? What does it mean to be a good man or a fine young man?
Yeah, well, the reason that this is a difficult question is because nobody quite rightly should want to give a single prescriptive answer, right? Because we know, even as we say it, like I have 3 sons, right? And so if I say a good man consists of ABC, I've got to be very careful that doesn't apply to one of my sons and not to another one. And I also don't want to just retreat to saying things that are about being a good human, right? Being kind, being thoughtful, being caring of others, etc. And so, because then you're just describing being a good human and you've dodged the question, right? So how do you answer the question in a way that doesn't exclude people, but that also doesn't dodge it? And in the end, what I think it comes down to is that being a good man is about giving more than you get. It is, if you look at the anthropology on this, it's like in most human societies, the point at which you're considered to be a man is when you are generating a surplus, whether that's of food or like energy, meat, etc., but that you are providing for the tribe, the family, the etc., right? That you're no longer just gathering the resources that you need for yourself, you're gathering the resources that you need for the group, right? For the wider group. So you become a quotes provider in that very communal sense. And because women are providing so much more directly reproductively, they're literally growing and feeding our absurdly young children, right? Their contribution is very, very direct, very immediate and absolutely precious. Whereas for men, it's always been somewhat more group-based, a bit more indirect. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, are you giving more than you get and are you contributing to the tribe? And one of the reasons why I think this is a weird horseshoe thing where people perhaps on the far left will say, I'm not sure we need men anymore. You know, thanks to the last 10,000 years, we've got it from here, economically speaking. And I'm caricaturing, almost no one actually thinks that. But then on the right, you have the kind of Andrew Tate type figures and the sort of super reactionary misogynists who actually say men should just be about themselves. Look after yourselves. Don't get married. She'll just take you for a ride. Don't get saddled. It's all about you. It's about your material. It's about your, showing off. It's all about you. It's incredibly narcissistic. It's incredibly individualistic. But true manhood, I think, comes through service, comes through community. It comes through that. It's very interesting to me right now that actually Pew survey recently found that a much higher share of men, young men, say that becoming a father having children is important to them than young women do. And I think that's because at some level, those young men realize that that is one of the things that they need. And it doesn't need to be their own kids. It could be a father figure, etc. But I think at some level as men, we do need to be needed. And because the need for us is somewhat less obvious, perhaps, culturally speaking, then how we feel that need for us is more fragile, it's more precious, and therefore has to be cultivated and guarded very carefully.
Mm-hmm. So my last question is about this term that we hear, we use, we see it everywhere: toxic masculinity. Is that a bad thing to be saying? Is it having a really negative impact on the problem we're talking about? Or is it just a real,
Yes.
is it just a real thing that we got to accept and deal with?
No, I am going to have as a metric for my success, Andy, that this is not a question that I get asked in 5 years' time, because the term has fallen largely into disuse. It's just gone the way that many terms do. I'd like to throw woke away along with it, by the way. Like, I just hope that 5 years of just these absurd terms have gone. The reason I don't, toxic masculinity as a term has done much more harm than good. Now, is it good to sometimes draw attention to certain ways of being stereotypically male that are bad? Sure. But to bundle it just as toxic masculinity, it puts the words too close together. It frames it in a way that is very, very off-putting to young men. It doesn't work. Like, there are very few men who are excited by a conversation about how they can learn to be not toxic. Like, roll up. We can teach you to not be poisonous. How would you like to be not poisonous? How would you like to be a non-toxic man? It's not a very inspiring vision. And so by framing it negatively, by saying we're going to start with this negative and make you not that, right? You've sent them running for the hills, and quite right too, in a way. And then the conceptual problem with it is that when you ask people who use the term toxic masculinity to define non-toxic masculinity, they end up defining stereotypical femininity. So if I have this conversation, it's okay, they say, no, but not all masculinity is toxic. It's okay, well, give me some non-toxic masculine traits then. And they'll say, oh, care, emotional availability,
sensitivity,
being sensitive, being willing to cry, and say, okay, and how is that different from stereotypical femininity? And they'll typically then at that point go, oh no, it's the same. So, okay, so what you're basically saying is you can either be toxic or feminine. Well, no wonder you're losing the boys, right? I mean, that's like, and so they're not willing to actually articulate then some aspects of masculinity, again, all at the average, that are good, because they're afraid that if you say men are good in the following way, you're somehow saying women aren't like that, and that's bad. So you end up in this incredible bind where you find yourself very, very able to list all the bad things about men and masculinity, but unable to articulate a single good thing about it. And that is the trap that too many people on the center left and the progressives have got themselves into, which is they just don't have like, actually, Barack Obama said it brilliantly recently. He said on his wife's podcast, he said, we have said a lot about what is wrong with young men. We have not said enough about what is right with young men. What's good about men? What's good about young men? And again, I was at this panel recently with these young men, and I said, look, do you like being a guy? And look, if you like being a guy, all of them, fine. And then someone asked the follow-up question. What do you like about being a guy? What's good about being a man? What's good about being a... Not a single one of them could give an answer.
Interesting.
And so it's possible he didn't have one. It's also possible in an environment like that, they're just not going to say it. And so I think that absent any mainstream or positive story to tell about why we need men, why men are good, we will continue to lose this battle. We will lose men to the reactionaries, because the reactionaries do have a story to tell them about being a man. And it's a bad story, but the thing is, a bad story beats no story. And right now, center left, until very recently, has had no story not a positive story about men. And I'm afraid that's created a vacuum that has led to the cultural position we're in right now. And so we need to look out to ourselves rather than just look to blaming the men.
So much to think about. Great conversation, Richard. Right. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was fun.
Hope you'll come back and chat with me again.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for this work.
Alrighty. Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.